Welcome, everyone. I'm Sophie Volpe, Chair of the Center for Chinese Studies. I'm thrilled to host today's panel, Powers Entwined, in partnership with Dean Geeta Anand and Berkeley Journalism, as well as the Asia Society of Northern California. We're grateful for the opportunity to further the conversation regarding the US and China, which is such a pressing concern across the globe. Our panel represents 50 years of China coverage for The New Yorker. The New Yorker has been such an important space for reporting on China over the past decades, and this is in large part due to the contributions of Orville Schell, Jia Jining, and Evan Osnos. I'm very pleased that our Chancellor, Carol Christ, is here to introduce the panel. Many thanks to our Chancellor for joining us tonight.
Good afternoon. On behalf of our campus community, it's my pleasure to welcome you to an event whose focus could not be more timely or of greater relevance for all of us who are concerned about rising tensions and deepening complexities across the international landscape in general and with China in particular. As a public university, deeply engaged in the issues of the day and deeply involved in the quest for understanding across a wide array of academic disciplines and interests, we're grateful for our ability to serve as an indispensable venue for discussions like these. I want to thank the Asia Society of Northern California for co-sponsoring this event. I also wish to express my deep respect and appreciation for the extent to which the Center for Chinese Studies, as well as the Journalism School, are making possible this important and incisive consideration of contemporary relations between the United States and China. What makes this era all the more interesting and all the more fraught is the extent to which relations between the two countries are characterized by both conflict and connection. Given that Berkeley is a global university and the very antithesis of an isolated ivory tower, it should come as no surprise that these cross-currents are impacting and engaging our campus on a daily basis. We are, for example, aware of and disturbed by reports that these geopolitical tensions are at times having detrimental effects on academics in China, as well as here in the US, including Berkeley. International students and faculty are essential to our academic mission, and we must continue to prioritize their well-being. At the same time, we cannot, as an institution of higher education, turn a blind eye towards shared challenges such as climate change and global public health crises that demand academic exchange and interaction. We are, suffice it to say, living in complicated times, and we're fortunate to have with us today 3 stellar panelists to help bring clarity to the complexity. Evan Osnos is a staff writer at The New Yorker, a CNN contributor, and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Based in Washington, D.C., he writes about politics and foreign affairs. He was the China correspondent at The New Yorker from 2008 to 2013. His first book, Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China, won the 2014 National Book Award for Nonfiction and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Evan is also the author of Biden, The Life, The Run, and What Matters Now, and Wildland, The Making of America's Fury. Orville Schell is the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York, and a former professor and former dean at Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He worked for the Ford Foundation in Indonesia, covered the war in Indochina as a journalist, and has reported on China since the mid-70s. Orville is the author of 15 books, 10 of them about China, and a contributor to numerous edited volumes. Orville is also a fellow at the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia University and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Jia Jining is a writer, journalist, and cultural commentator in both English and Chinese. She's the author of 2 books in English, Tide Players, the movers and shakers of a rising China, and China Pop, how soap operas, tabloids, and bestsellers are transforming a culture. She's also the author of 6 nonfiction and fiction books in Chinese, the most recent being Freedom is Not Free. Her work has appeared widely in publications such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, and the Chinese literary magazine Du Shu. A recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, she's also been a regular commentator on current events on Chinese television and works as the China representative of the India-China Institute at the New School in New York. Born and raised in Beijing, educated in China and the US, Jia Zhenying lives in Beijing and New York. Thank you all for your interest and attendance. I know this time will be well spent.
Well, let me get this rolling here. Thank you, Carol, who was a great comrade in arms when I was here, a lowly scribe masquerading as a dean. And Sophie Volpe, right here, has done a wonderful job in putting this together and putting the, sort of engaging the university in this great effort. Thanks, Sophie. So all 3 of us were friends. We've all been trying to figure out this China conundrum for the length of our lives. I thought it would be interesting just to start off to get, and then we 3 are just going to talk and I will sort of recede as moderator. But what did you all think 10 years ago, 15 years ago would be the outcome of this China Odyssey? And then I want you to tell me why you think we are now where we are. But let's start with that. So, Jenny, you grew up in China.
Yeah.
What was in your head before you came here, after you came here? Where did you see history is evolving toward?
Well, I'm actually could be labeled as the engagement baby in a way, because I'm, of course, one of the millions of Chinese beneficiaries of Nixon's visit to China. I was a 12 years old Beijing middle school girl, and when he was visiting, it was my first middle school group activity to go out at night to shovel snows for Nixon, so that
we
he
all
could
did a
be,
little of that.
yeah, so we were supposed to be like really contributing to the, the Mao, revolutionary diplomacy. But anyway, the task was really to make sure it was a heavy snow that he make it to the Great Wall, and he did, of course, and that was the moment where he said, the 2 people coming out of such different history and culture will be together, will have a great understanding, and and here we are. So that was, I think the first time where people like me, born and schooled of really a virulent sort of anti-American imperialist kind of education, began to see a glimpse of a different future, maybe a different possibility between these 2 countries. And of course, the rest is history. I was among the first, Chinese students to come here, and I belong to that generation who had a very romantic, sort of image of U.S., and we expected nothing but getting better from there. So this is really a heartbreaking moment for us. I mean, the past few years, I think, my generation of Chinese, some have gone back to China, some stayed here, like myself, and I've been constantly going back and forth. And of course, we all kind of experienced this kind of disappointment, anguish, and disbelief, really, about how we could get here from there. And with a really prolonged kind of honeymoon, few decades in so many sense. So, I mean, that's my beginning, and I can't believe I'm sitting here talking about this kind of topic, and I know a lot of my friends who have similar journeys are, either here or there quietly kind of battling a kind of despair almost, thinking this relationship can only get worse,
So before we turn to Evan, let me just ask you, where did you think, as you were on your odyssey to America and in America, where did you think things would go? Did you think when Deng Xiaoping came into power and waved his wand that the past, Mao, the Cultural Revolution, was just over and vanished and we were going to sail forth into a halcyon future? What did you think?
I think the 1980s was a very, kind of hopeful decade leading up to 1989, to Tiananmen. That was, I think, until then, I think we did have a kind of naive, but almost a collective kind of vision of things are going to get, we're not going to become a democracy, and no one, at least not soon, but we'll be gradually heading to that direction. Until Tiananmen, I think that was a shock. And since then, I think people kind of splintered. And if you really look back in the 90s and till now, the image of America or U.S.-China relations have kind of darkened almost imperceptibly. And there were these flaring up moments where you register, oh God, that romantic vision of America that our generation shared has faded, has become with the embassy bombing incident, and then later, the trade war is much later because, frankly, China, had a great ride, especially after WTO. So people really continue. I would say the majority of the Chinese continue to have this very positive view of America until something happened. I think, but I was going to say that those dark moments and the gradual kind of, more so-called, sobering image of America and its relations with China had gradually grown with best-selling books like China Can Say No.
Right.
That's 1990s. But nothing prepared us with, the sort of rapid deterioration since, I think, basically Xi Jinping came to power. It's not immediately, but it was, accelerating.
So we'll put a pin in that because to come back to it. But Evan, you first went to China late 90s?
Yeah,
And,
96.
what was in your head? And as you were covering it over the next couple decades, were you a child of engagement? Did you think that engagement was going to bend the metal of Leninism and change things?
He's too young for that.
Well, I was going to say, actually, though, I was shoveling snow for Bill Clinton. Because I was a student for the first time in Beijing in '96, and I had gotten, I was, and I wouldn't be saying this just to flatter Jia Jianyang if we've done this before, if we weren't sitting here, but I was a sort of child of the China pop generation, by which I mean people who were really interested and seized by this sudden kind of fluorescence of interesting stuff happening in China, culturally and everything after post-Tiananmen. It was in this really interesting and complicated dynamic, and we'll turn this question to you, Orville, because I want to hear your sense of this, but always that interaction between an authoritarian politics and this dynamic cultural and social space was thrilling. That intersection of the two. And you didn't exactly know how the story was going to go, but there was energy in that encounter. When I was a student in '96, I remember a friend of mine was in a band, and they would sing mostly Chinese songs, but they had one English song, which was Hotel California. And they would sing it twice in every booking because they just started the show with Hotel California, and then they worked their way back to it again. And if you only saw them once, you thought, well, okay, we'll give them that. But if you saw them every night, you realized they really had a limited repertoire. But then, and I mentioned Bill Clinton because that was the year, roughly thereabouts. I came back in '98 as a student again. And that was the period when you remember, and you may remember exactly when he went,
99.
in 99. Maybe you were on that trip when he visited Beijing and was famously asked, what do you think the internet's going to do to China? And he said, trying to control the internet is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. And in some ways, that was a guiding philosophy, not just about technology, but this general sense that this big soup of institutions and capabilities and values that were emanating from the West would have this almost uncontrollable power. That's not quite the same as saying it's going to bring, quote unquote, democracy to China. But that was the understanding, certainly, for a long time. And I was a journalist there from 2005 to 2013. And if you wanted to draw a peak of that period of assumption, it would be those Olympics in 2008. And all of the aspiration and the hope that was wrapped up in that, and what that might mean, what it signified, was in a sense now either a misunderstanding or an illusion. And I think we probably need to kind of figure out which. But I'm curious, Orville, you've been through this arc of seeing all of these hopes for it, of seeing all of these deferring hope and then maybe abandoning it at times and then reclaiming it. And what was the animating impulse for you with China, and how much of that is the same today?
I think you sort of touched a really important point that what was exciting about being in China was you didn't really quite know which of the many prevailing forces within the society would triumph. And it was back and forth. And I think it's a really important insight to continue to understand that even now, when we have Xi Jinping, where there's a landscape that seems very defoliated and very uniform, that there exists still within Chinese society these opposing impulses and forces that are incipient and still there, and I fully believe will re-express themselves again. Now, you look at Chinese history and you see this sort of waxing and waning. So I think that's what makes it so interesting and so exciting. But we are at a place now where it seems like it's come full stop to something that won't move. But when I went to China first time in 1975, I thought Mao's China was what we were going to get for, et eternum. But it wasn't. A couple of years later, the landscape shifted. So let me ask you both, why did it shift back now? And how do you see the changes that have happened both within China and the way China deports itself in relationship to the rest of the world? Jenny, you start.
I think we're probably thinking in the same direction.
I have a hunch we might.
Yeah. Well, you wrote a big profile about Xi Jinping. This was, which year was this?
Yeah, 2015. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're probably thinking of the man because talking about this shift, China, we know, have always been this, under CCP at least, it's been a one-party rule. It's a party state. Even though through the 1980s, in the Deng years, he sort of did this collective, wanting to absorb the lesson of the Mao cult of personality, but we really didn't expect Xi to come up, right? And has since, I think now we could almost say it has become, instead of the rule of one party, is the rule of one man, almost. So I'm wondering do you agree with that, or that's too simplistic a view to just, throw everything on one man's?
No, I very much see almost sort of I think we've all been trained to say, well, it can't just be one person, and we have to look at the systemic interaction with the individual. But in certain systems, when a certain person, and we see this in other systems too, whether it's in Moscow or at times in our own system, one person, as the wind blows, so shall the grass lay. And it has a tremendous impact on how people conduct themselves, and it ripples through the system. But I would actually frame it I would look at it in one way, which is what made Xi Jinping Xi Jinping? Because I think there are sort of the near-term explanations. You could go back, and this would be quite satisfying, to do the full Freudian investigation of...
Please.
Well, I need a couch, I think, to begin. The New Yorker is as close as you can come to doing it. I mean, I do think you have to... You do want to understand what are those primal fears for him. What is it that he's ultimately afraid of? What is it that shaped him in his life? And I think a lot of people here will have some knowledge of this and of his life, but you cannot understand him without thinking about what was he going through at the age of 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. What he was going through was this terror of a kind. First, it was eventually the Cultural Revolution, but even before that, I mean, there is interesting scholarship going on now about his father, and just this will come out in more form before long. I don't want to get ahead of the author, but there are moments when Xi Jinping came home after his father had been purged, and he found him sitting alone in the dark in their home after having ascended to the heights of party power. And I think in somewhere in that span and the kind of precipitous terror of that collapse is some of the origin of his relationship to order and to control and to the idea of rejecting what scares you. And we'll have a conversation up here about things like what role did the financial crisis play, what role did the internet play, and the Arab Spring. But I think you do, in some ways, have to go back to the person and look at what shaped that person. Would you have ever imagined that there could be a Xi Jinping coming out of the generation of the children of Deng Xiaoping and the grandchildren of Deng Xiaoping, politically speaking?
I have to say, I didn't see it coming. I don't think anybody did. But I think what you're suggesting, Evan, is that, in order to understand global politics, particularly where it gravitates around big leader culture, which it certainly does in Russia and China, you do need to have some fundamental, almost literary understanding of the hero in the play and what animates that person besides national interest, the economy. So you were very good at this, Jianying, and sort of looking at things in a more psychological fashion. So what do you think are the forces that came through Chinese history that got embedded in Xi, that made him Xi, and made him, as we see him today? I mean, you have to ask yourself, what leader of China would antagonize Canada, India, Sweden, Norway, Australia, I think I said India, but countries that were the non-aligned nations, the friendliest people. What's going on here? What do you think?
Well, to go back to the psychological, I think we may have touched on this before. I see China as not just Xi Jinping, the whole society and so many people in it as kind of a traumatized society. Many people, both the persecuted and the persecutor, in fact, are still living through that trauma, consciously or subconsciously. I mean, I think this is a American psychologist or political scientist define the trauma as is a historical experience of survival, exceeding those the grasp of those who survived. So in a way, I feel we, as I personally came from. We're also a generation of Cultural Revolution. I came from a so-called intellectual family. It was easier and my parents went through, the usual persecution. It wasn't an uncommon story. So easy to see ourselves as sort of the victim and become, out of that experience, become the so-called liberal of fear. I think, because you just don't want anything but that fear. And we thought maybe Xi Jinping and his group of persecuted princelings share that with us. So this is part of the shock and the hope, sort of misplaced hopefulness about him. Oh, finally, our generation, the Cultural Revolution, those honored, persecuted come to power, and this is going to be, getting better and more open. On the contrary. And this interesting, reminds me of an anecdote. Again, also, this is someone I can't name because he's really he's a child of a big red prince. Also had a horrible, downfall from a very top position. And he told me, he said, Jianying, I had a conversation with another red princeling. She said, he said to her, she said, we're the Jews of this country. And she was completely flabbergasted. She said, what do you mean? I thought we're the German, because they both are the part of this elite, the children of the top, and both parents fell, but they still think they're German. And I think psychologically, that's the flip, that probably there's of course, this goes case by case. This friend, these two, they have become actually the sort of liberals or traumatized put politics at a distance. But Xi Jinping, I think, being that group, probably took a very different lesson. Never forgot he's the German.
Or needed to be the German to survive.
I need to be, I have to be the German to survive. And of course, what better than being the German, the Führer?
The Ibasho.
Ibasho, exactly.
Yeah.
And this, I think, this could, of course, it is just a psychological reading. I don't know what he thought, but maybe the story you said about his youth.
I think one of the things the question has always been, did the experience of coming through that traumatic period make him hate the party or love the party? Does it make him hate Mao or love Mao? And it's not as simple a question as it sounds, actually. Do you have a theory of the case?
Well, there is that expression in Chinese, "Arbeifan." You have to be a 200%er. And the people who were persecuted, in order to regain standing and respect and a place in society, have to be redder than ordinary people. They have to be 200%ers. And I think there's a bit of that syndrome going on in him. I just read this interview, I was telling you, Evan, and you'd read it before, a wonderful, strange interview with Xi Jinping in 2000 by a very obscure little Chinese publication that got picked up by the Norwegians and published in Denmark. And it was all about Xi's life in Shanxi province, up to his teenage years. And it said how he tried 9 times to get into the youth league as a precursor to getting into the party. And he failed because his father was a counter-revolutionary. But he didn't give up. He did get in. So I think you could say, and again, this is very mushy territory for journalists, scholars, or anybody to get into, but I think it's simply very human to understand people, and because people are people. I think he learned he had to struggle, he had to prevail, and he did.
And there are those moments of almost accidental candor when he reveals something quite deeply of himself. And when he talked not too long after taking the top job about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and his comment was, as he said at the time, nobody was man enough to stand up and resist. And that kind of fusion of the very personal and the sense of a nation's fate, of everything under heaven resting on your shoulders, has that, I think, it's fused. And that actually is is an interesting and worrisome question too, is how much does he see himself as, how much is he China and how much is China Xi? I mean, we've seen the dangerous version of that in Russia. I would make a case that it's not the same. Actually, I think there is difference there. But I think, I'm coming from Washington. I'm sorry, I don't hold that against him. But in Washington right now, there's become a kind of casual equation between Russia and China. And China's not doing anything to counteract that narrative.
And Ukraine and
Exactly.
Taiwan.
That has become very much, and I think it's, we should probably think about that question. That is certainly becoming the operating thesis in Washington.
Though I think that the Russian-China, if you come back to the leader,
Yeah.
for example, because many people before Xi changed the term limit said, "Oh, he's a Putin wannabe," and he very early on, I think in the first meeting, told Putin, "We're alike."
very similar,
Yeah, we're
yeah.
similar. So when you say man enough, almost you would see, Putin is his idol, but no one, actually, I doubt Putin would see that bromance that way because, with one is on a horseback handling a tiger, the other is pudgy cute. If any of you see kicking the football, right, soccer, you only notice the gleaming leather shoes. However, I think underneath that, sort of demeanor and all that, it was something very Chinese. Why would he succeed to be on the top? And I think the Western journalism, media often focus on how he switched from Deng's 韬光养晦, this is the hide your strengths and bide your time, as he's the national policy, but his rise to power was that philosophy. He hid his strengths and bided in time, and no one saw him as the man, the real Nair, because he looked so unthreatening. From every sense of the word, this modest, sort of soft guy. Everyone thought he was a nice guy. But as soon as he arrives, this is very legalist. I think we talked about this. He arrived at that high perch. It's like a Sichuan, 川剧, this Chuan opera, the 变脸,
Yeah.
immediately everyone saw the truth. The ruthless, sort of a quiet ruthlessness and the efficiency of him since he became number one, 一把手, I think surprised all of us. That he very methodically, waited his time, and then once he's there, he very methodically kind of wiped out all the rivals and took China. And his agenda, I think from there on, if we really look at what he said, he pretty much spoke his mind.
Yeah.
Except
If you
those
can
long
actually
messages.
read his speeches,
Exactly.
which most people don't have the
Yeah.
stomach for because they're not very, they're kind of turgid, but he actually
Yeah.
says what he thinks.
Yeah.
And you actually can learn a lot. Let me ask you, Evan, the great writer Lu Xun often spoke of the close relationship between sort of slave and master, and that people who have been victimized often turn into victimizers.
Yeah.
I wonder if that sense of the urgency that she feels of restoring China's state of greatness, the rejuvenation theme, is a kind of a version of wanting to be exactly the kind of great power that he felt historically persecuted China.
Yeah, I think one of the expressions that he uses that's revealing is when he talks about Taiwan, but you could apply this principle broadly, he says this problem cannot be passed from generation to generation, which is in a sense an announcement that I'm going to do something about this larger issue, which to his mind is about making China strong. And I think, he is very much a kind of product of the period of the curriculum of humiliation, coming up with the knowledge of the ways in which China had been carved up like a melon, to use the expression that it was kind of in vogue. And so he gets into this position of a very different relationship to the West than his predecessors had. When Hu Jintao was in charge, it was still, China was hiding its strength and biding its time. It was still the sort of younger cousin, obviously Jiang Zemin even more so, and Deng Xiaoping was the hinge in history between China being kind of enraged and secluded and then beginning to come out in the world. So Xi Jinping now finds himself in this place where it's now actually at near parity with the West. And that poses a decision of a certain kind. Do you say, never again will we allow ourselves to be boxed up and contained? I mean, the recent kind of upsurge of anger in Chinese official language around containment is quite meaningful, I think, and quite telling. Because I think that idea of China being contained is a deep neuralgic fear. Because that, in the end, is how they think the story ends if they allow it to end that way. Does that resonate?
On the other hand, I mean, you could look at it this way. China has accomplished something absolutely extraordinary in history. They have taken what was the sick man of Asia.
Yeah.
They've turned it into a marvel of development, modernization. They have a strong military. They're, in many ways, the envy of the world. So if all of that is true, why isn't Xi Jinping just basking in that glory? Why is he out with wolf warrior diplomacy, antagonizing everybody? How do you explain that?
I think,
No.
my short take is, I think there was a period of experimentation particularly after Trump arrived, not just in the presidency, but sort of in public culture. Trump was he was the first wolf warrior, right? I mean, he was the one who kind of came out and was talking about the world in very confrontational, belligerent terms, talking mostly about Americans that way. But he sort of ushered in this idea that might work. I mean, he became president of the United States. And all of a sudden, there was this kind of, well, maybe that's actually the way that you exert strength. I'm not saying that Xi Jinping was basing this off of the Donald Trump model. But I think there was this period of, well, maybe that's actually how we're going to make friends. And of course, it didn't work. China is today in a very tense, as you've described, very tense relationship with all kinds of countries that aren't the United States. But I don't know the answer to the question of why they decided to go down. What do you think is the reason why they went down that road?
Yeah, I would agree with you with the Trump acting as a trigger. I mean, he's triggered so many things. But I don't think it was a short-term reaction to a particular president. I think, as we just said, Xi Jinping's this whole vision was there before Trump emerged. But maybe Trump accelerated, and it was turned to his, in a way, to his advantage to, use Trump has become the boogeyman among the Chinese nationalists. As if this is how U.S. is the ugly American and who hate China, shouldn't we unite behind Xi Jinping or anybody? And that's very easy. But I'm not sure he's the origin of Xi Jinping's agenda. I think that goes deeper and longer to, he is, after all, like me, a child of, this nationalist education. And, and he was not one of the, my generation who actually embraced and went abroad and had, true interactions with the outside world. He's, everybody knows here he's one of the last 工农兵学员. This is the worker soldiers. And that, here you can't, it's easy to think of him as a little Mao. Mao bears that grudges as, not the elite, university students and being, kind of snubbed by all these so-called, more cosmopolitan intellectuals who come back from, Hu Shi and all this, Beida and all this. He was just a lowly library. And Xi Jinping suffers that, I think, Mao was actually really irritated. But Xi Jinping truly is, this. I think there's a snobbery among Chinese intellectuals who constantly mock Xi Jinping as a dumb guy. He's not a dumb guy. But in terms of education, that is something that he wanted to show. I think China doesn't need to take this cosmopolitan sort of relying on the sort of bourgeois class who are, just kind of in love with so many things of the West, the wealth, the lifestyle, the red wine, and all this. And if you watch, Xi Jinping, his first wife was the sort of the daughter of a diplomat. And two, he's most uptight when he's kind of interacting with, I think, Western leaders. I mean, the only experience he had was that 1 year in Iowa. Where
That wasn't
Not
even
even
a
a year,
year.
a couple of weeks.
a couple of weeks.
Exactly. But to your point, it was this
Yeah.
very brief encounter.
Yeah, and it was in Iowa, and
Yeah.
then where he could feel probably a little bit, it was kind of earthy, down. I mean, but so I think that was part of his thing. Want to take China into the Chineseness, like Mao. Mao was always talking about, these, 喝洋墨水，吃面包的 Moscovite, they don't know what China is and where China should go. I think Xi Jinping, in that sense, is truly sort of a pupil of Chairman Mao. So,
Evan, you've followed Biden pretty closely. I watched Xi on 2 trips. One, I happened to go to China with Trump, which was one of the great.
We need a whole other session for
circuses
that,
of
I
my
think,
life.
with the couch.
Yeah. And I also watched Biden and Xi when they were vice presidents. And I had the sense in just watching Xi, of course I didn't get to talk to him, that he's profoundly uncomfortable, as you suggest, Jianying, in the sort of cosmopolitan world.
Yeah.
He doesn't speak English, doesn't speak French, he can't. And here's Biden, and this is my question to you. I mean, if there was ever a glad-handing, back-slapping, hey, how you doing, guy, it surely is Biden. And I thought maybe he could thaw Xi out, but no. Xi never cracked through that Mona Lisa-like smile that gives away nothing.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you look at that interaction between Xi and Biden, because we thought maybe Biden was the guy who could get to him.
Yeah, you're so right to identify that encounter. In some ways, Biden, is the Jiang Zemin of American politics.
Yes.
He likes the
Big and goofy.
he likes to get out there and get involved in the room, as Jianying was describing, and this, in a sense, Xi Jinping is the anti-cosmopolitan. I mean, Deng Xiaoping had been in Paris. As we know, Jiang Zemin was in Moscow. There was an element of a kind of at home in the worldness that Xi Jinping is quite wary of.
Wanting to be part of the world.
Wanting to be part of it, wanting to be fluent, to be sort of conversant in the world. Biden is a person who is born with this kind of natural, he would describe it as a kind of what he would call the Irishness about him, which is a kind of a natural cosmopolitan quality, because they were always immigrants. They were always on the move. And, I've been with Biden overseas at times, watched him in the US. I've seen him use the same line in various places. He's quite a seasoned politician, and I've watched him. He has one line that he uses that works in Baghdad or in Kyiv or in Delaware, which is, he says to people, if I had hair like yours, I'd be president. And I don't think he can do it now, actually, because he has to tweak it. But
he probably said that to Xi Jinping.
I bet he did. I bet he did. Well, and you can imagine, how would Xi Jinping respond to that? He'd think, what the heck do I do with this guy? And to Biden's immense credit, this is where I think, Biden has had a lot of time in politics. He's met a lot of different kind of leaders. He's formed that sense of just the kind of body language, the sort of the nature of leadership, the aroma of what somebody is. And he came back from that trip in 2011 and said to his national security staff, that man doesn't have a democratic bone in his body. And I think
He didn't get through to him.
about Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
I mean, that was his read on this. He said, this guy doesn't have a democratic bone in his body. And I think there was a way in which that didn't puncture the narrative that maybe Xi's going to be the guy that, but on some level, I think because they were speaking, you know, it was like, to use the Chinese expression, it was a duck talking to a chicken. These were two completely different modes of political communication.
Yeah.
And Biden said, there's no Irishness there. This guy is not,
That's lovely.
this
Yeah.
guy's not
So
my guy.
in other words, Biden doesn't have any magic with Xi.
There's really, and he has had more time, as we know, than any other American
Yeah.
leader,
Like something
president,
like
certainly.
20 times or more. by
It's
now.
hours and hours. I mean, he slightly overstates the number because they spent a lot of time together on these kind of sort of weird buddy comedy trips. One in China and then one in the U.S. actually, where they went to like a Lakers game or something like that.
I think he went with Jerry Brown.
That's right. That's
but
right.
I don't think he got through to him either.
So there's a degree to which, I mean, I think Xi Jinping was going out into the world with a certain kind of psychological armor.
Yeah.
Meaning he knew what he was going to do and he wasn't going to be dissuaded by a bunch of these glad-handers.
Yeah.
So in other words, the essence of diplomacy is, of course, give and take. And you have to open yourself up to some degree and not see concession or negotiation as a sign of weakness. Do you both wonder whether that is an impediment to Xi being more reciprocal and being willing to kind of yield sometimes to get something bigger and better for China? What do you think, Jenny?
Whether he has flexibility in terms
Yes,
of
whether the flexibility to him maybe occurs as weakness rather than strength.
Yeah.
And I think for Biden, it's strength.
Yeah.
Hey, let's make a deal.
100% right,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I mean, with Biden, you might say it's actually more than the body language of, you know, the Irishness. He's a real populist in his bone, in his long career, whether you think taking the, you know, train is a posture or not. But, you know, Xi Jinping spent 10 years in that village. And he's proud of that, and he's sort of made that part of his image. But I would say he's a fall populist. I mean, in spite of, even now, he's talking about all this prosperity and all this, seem to be, you know, that he really thinks about the people. Either I think this part of his whole vision needs the sort of populist image, but I feel, I mean, of course, this is just reading from he's famous for 接锅盖, this is in Chinese, no? He goes to, since he's become #1, he goes to all these poor villages and opens their pot to say, oh, your life is, you know, pretty good, right? Improved, right? And the party is good for you. But, you know, it becomes more and more of a sort of a emperor's posture of that. So I think that part, you know, we were talking about he's uncomfortable with the sophisticated Western cosmopolitan, but he's also, I think, increasingly more alienated from the sort of the peasants' roots in China. And if you think of looking down the road, I feel even though he's never kind of earned the love of the average Chinese like Mao did, I would say he's growing further, even further from that. But earlier, I mean, he's because of partially the economy and you know, where things go, and this whole, you know, so far he's come so far. He's really have, you know, I think alienated, beginning with alienating, you know, the Western world, and probably, I would say down the road, he'll have trouble domestically, though it's hard to see now because I think it's going to be worse before it gets better. I mean, depending on what you think, right? From which point of view, but.
Well, at some point we want to get to questions. Are we near that point? Well, let me ask one other final question. Where do you both think this is going?
I'm deeply, deeply worried. I'm really worried about it because of all of the things that we've talked about here, and then also in Washington, which is another foreign land that I now inhabit. It feels, I am watching this kind of, the mechanism of what is the right word? It's not confrontation, because confrontation can be good. It's the mechanism of excessive consensus. Right now, there's a kind of degree to which in Washington, Democrats and Republicans are very pleased to have found something to agree on. And 20 years ago, I was covering the beginning of the war in Iraq. I was embedded with these Marine infantry, kids. And that, for me, was a great lesson in be skeptical when there's too much consensus. And I'm worried right now that in Washington, we're at a period where it's become assumed that the US and China are necessarily on a path towards some sort of war.
And I think it was you that said, or maybe it was you, Jianying, that Xi Jinping had said that it's over with the United States. There's no heat.
I was quoting Wang Jisi.
Oh yeah, Wang
So
Jie.
this is Wang Jisi's. It's going around on the Chinese
He's
internet
a foreign
right
affairs
now.
expert from China.
Yeah, he was the head of American Institute, and he supposedly, maybe along with Zheng Bijian, coined the word of peaceful rising. And now for him to say,
Yeah.
the top, 最高决策者, says no expectations of any improvement of U.S.-China relations from here on.
And of course, this presumption that there's an antagonistic contradiction between East and West democracy and whatever the People's Republic of China represents is something that's been deeply steeped in the history of the country. Sometimes it recedes and sometimes it rises.
Yeah.
But do you think we're at a place where that presumption is irreversible?
I think it's reversible, actually. I mean, I think one of the lessons from the last 25 years, and it goes to where we started this whole conversation, was some humility about what we know and what we don't know, and about things that we assume to be ordained or on the sort of heading in a certain direction. I'm not of the view, actually, that this relationship is necessarily required to end in one place. I think there's a tremendous amount of variability. It depends on who's at the top, depends on what happens in the economy, it depends on events that we cannot anticipate right now. But I think that, in some sense, one of the things that I think about is one of the lessons for us is to remain open to that possibility that things can change abruptly, and we need to be alert to those possibilities.
I think I agree, and a footnote to that is under the Wang Jisi report about this is irreversible. This is in Chinese, and then the first three follow. What do you call that? Post commentary. The first one is, 只要一个人换了一个人，就明天就可以变。This means if we remove one person, change one person, everything. And then the second post in Chinese too is 我同意. And the third is in English.
I agree.
I agree. And third in English is who is that person? So I think, a lot of people are thinking the same, and not to overemphasize the one leader's power. This is a system structurally giving such a tremendous weight to this one person, and to go into the Chinese sort of character, psychological study, out of fear can come, hope, and out of fear can come kind of duplicity or. I'm thinking of, so many Chinese. I would bet not just my friends who are, a lot of them are diehard kind of, reform and open or liberals. A lot of other people in the system right now up there have this kind of, I think, duplicity because they know this is becoming a rule of one man. So out of fear of personal demise, they would say the same thing. But, this could change tomorrow. Otherwise, she would not be starting yet again a round of this latest campaign is about loyalty. But so many people are, this Chinese phrase, 揣着明白装糊涂. You hide hide their strengths and, bide their time. This is a hopeful thinking, but because Chinese are so, I think, it's so deep in the culture, this sort of, you might say, almost a moral kind of flexibility, just, survival.
Get through it.
Yeah, get through it. But, there's a chance things could, this one man could suddenly become reckless, or something could happen,
Yeah.
right?
Or he could die
or-
as Mao did, and then everything changed.
Yeah,
What
but
do you-
I mean, he could live till 95. Then
Well,
we
he
won't
could.
see it. Evan might see it, but
Orville, what do you
we
think?
won't.
What's your answer to that question? Where do you see this going?
I sort of agree with you, Evan. I feel very dark and gloomy about what I see happening. And I think the United States should make every conceivable effort to keep the door open and find off-ramps. But I don't think this is possible without reciprocity. And I see precious little reciprocity. That's what deeply alarms me. And then I see people like Xi Jinping and Putin and the Iranians and the North Koreans and Hungary and whatnot getting together. It's something that looks frighteningly to me like the Allies and the Axis that were generated before World War II. But I hope that doesn't happen. And I do think that our government is actually, despite the consensus that you fear, and I do too, does keep the door ajar.
Yeah.
If there's any sign coming out of China, I think they would grab it. But the question is, why doesn't China give a signal? Why would, I sometimes feel, and I think I said this to you both, like I'm reading a Greek tragedy.
Yeah.
Overweening ambition, leading to a potential downfall of a very astute, intelligent leader with great accomplishments, and the whole kingdom comes crashing down around his ears. Anyway, listen, let's not end on that note. Let's uplift us with some of your questions. All right, right here.
Would somebody address what they believe is the relationship between China now and Russia and North Korea?
Weren't we going to have an uplifting one? I think. I mean, I could speak a little bit on the Russia-China, I guess. I mean, very briefly, I would say that they find themselves, it's a bit of a shotgun marriage. I think that they find themselves at a conjunction of interests, and I think they are mostly joined at the moment by this sense that it is us against the world.
Yeah.
I mean, there was that telling little bit of video that came out when Xi Jinping was bidding farewell to Vladimir Putin at the end of the visit. And,
Yeah.
he gave his line about these are changes unseen in a century, and then he added, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's up to the two of us to lead the charge or something.
Yeah,
And I thought
that's actually the best translation.
Is-
I've
yeah.
read various, it doesn't quite convey that.
What was it in
Lead the
Chinese?
charge.
to lead the charge.
这也是百年变局之一部分，我们共同来推动吧。推动 is more than, we're part of this.
So I feel like that's the crucial dynamic. Now that means that it can change. If Vladimir Putin is proven to be a loser, if he becomes a weak link in the chain, all of these things, there is not a deep, as we all know, I think in this room, there's not a deep, firm ground of friendship between the two. But it can cause a lot of problems in the meantime.
But I think they are bound together by, they both trade in grievance currency.
Yeah, very
And
much.
both are deeply aggrieved for, in their view, having their empires dismantled and them disrespected, disesteemed, marginalized by the arrogant, a little bit like what goes on in this country
Yeah.
between people who support Trump.
Yeah.
They're really arrogant coasts. Okay, we have another question right here.
Thank you for your sharing. I am a current Berkeley student and I am from China. So my dilemma is, in an era where we increasingly need to take sides, how should we position ourselves? Because the interest of the CCP and the interest of the Chinese citizen are so deeply intertwined. So on the one hand, we're certainly angry of the policy of the CCP and the Xi Jinping, and we want democracy and freedom. But on the other hand, we are also Chinese. So confrontational policies will inevitably affect our interests, such as the China Initiative under Trump administration. So what's your opinion on this issue?
Jianying, I think that's in your wheelhouse.
Well, that separation from the CCP and the Chinese people had been actually, I think, was official U.S. policy, become official policy in the Pompeo team. And I thought that was a very important differentiation. And it's certainly true that the Chinese people are by number the largest and the most immediate victim of a totalitarian rule. However, I think the picture is more complicated than that, and no one can separate the government or the political system from its people. Even though people think, oh, there's no election, so that nobody elected this system. But if you go to actually the surveys, that's another, of course, hard to quantify. It's true, I think, the majority of Chinese people, despite of everything, are still supporting this mode of governance. And whatever you say about the brainwashing or the nationalism, whatever, that is the majority mood. So I think in that sense, we cannot, it's important to remember the separation, but also important to remember this factor. And it's not going to be a short term. There's no short term solution. And I don't know how to answer taking sides. I think Chinese people are going to take different sides. Going by what you're saying. And I'm sure, Americans, of course, always taking different sides. The bipartisan, issue on China, if you paid attention to the congressional hearings on TikTok, it's seemingly they're united, but immediately afterwards you hear a cacophony of positions in terms of free speech. The Democrats against it, and Republican senators against it. Young people are in arms about it. And it's just going to be an exhausting fight, I think. And this is, the people, too. It's not just the politician. But I, again, being a generation from, from what I said, Cultural Revolution, how I know how great, what a world-class talent the Chinese Communist Party and the government have in sort of spinning off surveillance, manipulating popular opinions, and the whole generation of young little pinks, they're all Chinese, okay? A lot of them have been to the West, and now the game have moved to here. And congratulations, they're so great in enlisting huge amount of support on TikTok among the young Americans. But for me, I feel very worried, because I grow up, since Nixon's visit, our generation's number one issue is free speech. But often we get here and you see free fall. All this amount of, information here hooked by, let's get back to the TikTok. I think that's, you're looking at almost, I picture like a hedgehog chasing a fox in a matrix, jungle, and the algorithm is written by the Chinese. It's so it both speaks to the talent, the flexibility and the complexity of this whole fight. So I'm not sure. This is a long answer. But
TikTok is a box we probably don't dare open tonight, but it's a good one. The young woman back here, yes.
Thank you, all three of you guys, for sharing your thoughts. So I had a question about actually related to free speech, in other words, the surveillance state in China. So we were actually assigned with Professor Schell's the Life of a Party article, Foreign Affairs article, a few days ago in class. And then I remember Professor Schell kind of talking about the self-confidence of the Chinese party, the CCP in general. And then I was just wondering what's everyone's thoughts on whether, to what extent is the CCP self-confident if they have the need to surveillance the general population, and whether or not if they're willing to compromise at all in terms of the surveillance. Because I'm also from China, and I personally feel like it's gotten an impact on my life.
So that's a wonderful question. Why, if a nation is self-confident, does it feel the need to do such heavy surveillance and control? Evan?
It is true that it's, at its moments of fragility and self-doubt that you begin to impose these structures. I mean, if you look at America's history, remember the PRISM project, which we created after 9/11 to study ourselves and to try to catch threats. That was in this period where we were feeling very kind of uneasy about our own safety. And I think, China, it's sort of the big tell. China reveals how insecure it feels, how the party feels, how the national security organs feel about themselves by creating this vast apparatus to try to protect themselves from the people that in theory they are protecting. It's the thing that I hear about from young Chinese people as one of the great irritants and insults, actually. It feels infantilizing and frustrating, and it feels as if you're not treating us like who we think we are. So the question I've always wondered is it a political risk for the government? Is it the kind of thing that makes people organize? And so far the answer is no.
Right here on the front.
Since you guys were talking about surveillance, I want to share a personal experience. As you know, in the Bay Area here, you will not dare leave anything in your car because it's going to be broken. Even if you don't have anything, you leave it out in the street, it may get broken. It's very easy. I experienced that. 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, I was in Shenzhen. And we check out of the hotel at 11 a.m. We have a night flight at 10 o'clock to go to Dubai. And my wife's cousin picked us up in his car and to take us around. And his trunk was full of stuff. And he wanted to put my luggage in the front. I said, no, don't do that. It's going to be stolen. He said, no, don't worry about it. They have surveillance camera all over the place. Anyone who's going to break into my car, they'll catch them in 15 minutes. Sure enough, we put the luggage in the front of the car. We went out, we ate, we went shopping, we went all over the place. Nothing happened. Okay. So for me, as a law-abiding citizen, that's great protection for me. Okay. I talk to my children; they agree. So I think a lot of times the system is designed to protect the people. And same here. When in Washington last week, or maybe last month, they had even when the Trump indictment was happening, they were installing cameras all over the place. And in my neighborhood in Lafayette, they had cameras. The police know where they are. I ask them, they tell me where it is. Okay, so we have them, they have them, everybody has them. It's just that we blame them for controlling the people. But to me, it's protecting the people. Just want to share my experience.
Well, I think it's undeniable that a system that's as well organized as China's does provide a certain stability and certain kinds of protections.
Right.
The
20 years ago, Shenzhen and Guangzhou, notorious for mugging, for purse snatching. You see on the video all the time. Right now, nothing. It's all fixed.
I think we can hand them that. The question is, we don't live by bread alone. Human beings want other things. They want to be able to express themselves, and the whole question of freedom arises. But no, I don't want my Tesla smashed and have my computer stolen. Nobody does. And they do a very good job at that. Let's hand it to them. The Chinese Communist Party has done a very good job at a lot of things. But on the question of politics and political control and a few other things, I think we'd have to wonder whether it's the kind of society in which we would like to live.
Would you like to move to Shenzhen?
Well, maybe before we stop here, we have one more question? Okay, right here. Well, yes, okay. Well, Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm assistant professor in sociology. So I'm wondering, you spent a lot, since we're talking about power, we're talking about a relationship, so it takes two to tango. And I'm wondering, since you hinted, I guess some of you have hinted at the U.S. role in this changing relationship. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about that. I'm also wondering if you could situate it in the context of the change of the world order. The perception of the United States, I think the favorable image of the U.S. has declined to the historical low during the pandemic. So it's not just in China, but also in global South. So when the empire is crumbling, what does that do to the China-U.S. relationship? Thank you.
Evan.
I think we could spend a second hour on that, probably. I think that you're absolutely right that it takes two to tango, and I think that baked in, and that is at the heart of our kind of topic this evening. The way I think of it is partly about the messages that we send to the rest of the world. I mean, it's not news that the United States power in the world is different than it was 50 years ago. In fact, it was Barack Obama who talked about it quite clearly. And people, in some ways, kind of embrace that idea that we have to figure out what does it mean to be an American power in the world. It's going to be different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century. But then there are other messages that we send, whether it was Donald Trump's America First language, and I would argue that it's actually oftentimes not the ones that we are designing the messages, it's the ones that we send accidentally. And if you look at something like January 6th, and you look at the messages that sent to the rest of the world, one of the messages was, this country's goose is cooked. This country has lost the ability to figure out how to govern itself and how to have a functioning democracy. And actually, that was a misreading. I think that one of the things that's hardest, if you look at the way that the United States since then has gone about this process of a very public examination and self-criticism and self-study of what happened on January 6th and what led up to it, that process of bearing it all out in public, same thing we did after Watergate, that process that's the core strength and the enduring thing that the United States has, which is, I think, at the core of the kind of perception spiral the US and China are in right now, is that Xi Jinping, and this gets to your point about what Wang Jisoo said, Xi Jinping has made the judgment that the United States is in inexorable decline. And that fails to understand, I think, or to take stock of the fact of resilience and the possibility of resilience. I'm not sure that it's a preordained fact that we are resilient, but we have this enduring capacity to bounce back. And sort of misreading it or underestimating the capacity for that ends up makes Xi Jinping make mistakes. You can overreach when you think that the person across the table is flat on their back. And I think that as we think about our own role in this and the messages that we send out to the rest of the world, one of the ways that we can actually make ourselves safer is by projecting the image that we are, in fact, capable stewards of our own democracy, and that we recognize our faults and that we're trying to correct them. If we don't look like we're doing that, then we actually invite people to imagine that they are going to replace us.
Virginia, just to conclude, how is your sort of vision of America changed as a result of all of the vicissitudes that we've been through with Donald Trump and other presidents?
That will be a long answer, but I want to first say I agree with every word he says. And maybe, I'm an atheist, and this is maybe something that closest to I believe, almost religious. I can't reason, write a paper about it, but it's just there that I believe. I think the free world is going to win this. I didn't say Western world. I didn't say Western nation because I'm thinking of Japan, South Korea. I'm thinking of Australia, New Zealand, and India. Even though at the moment. But anyway, I'm thinking of the free individuals in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in mainland China, that is going to come together. This is our friend Jeremy talks about, the invisible republic of what is the invisible republic of the alternative
Yeah.
people or something like that.
Yeah.
I think
An
that's
invisible republic of different thinking.
of
beneath the
different
surface.
thinking. The other China is going to re-emerge, and I feel ultimately that's another thing I agree. I think the question is the U.S. Role by leading by example, by overcoming this messy moment is ultimately probably the most powerful force element to the two relations. Because the Chinese people are not dumb. I mean, that's what I just said. A lot of people seem to be like hating America now and saying the East is right. They're watching. They're watching. And they also know their own problems. I think a lot of people actually are getting more and more anxious about this whole, rejuvenation thing seem to be falling, a little short under that. And they're watching America, where to go. And here comes my belief. I think they will see.
Well, now that is an uplift.
Yeah, here it is.